The man in seat 37B kicked off his duct-taped shoes, shoved past the drink cart, and dropped to his knees over a woman who had stopped breathing. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she was worth $3 billion. He didn't care. His hands were cracked and calloused, still carrying the chemical ghost of industrial bleach from a midnight janitor shift that had ended 6 hours ago in a building where nobody knew his real name either. He found her throat, tilted her head back, and fought death at 30,000 feet, while 53 passengers watched from their seats and did nothing. One man in 3C raised his iPhone and started recording. Another adjusted his noise-canceling headphones. A woman in the second row clutched her husband's arm and whispered something about liability. The flight attendants rushed forward with pale faces and trembling hands and voices that cracked when they tried to sound calm. None of them touched the dying woman. None of them moved with the kind of certainty that lives in the muscle memory of someone who has held hundreds of bodies between this world and the next. Nathan Mercer had that certainty. It lived in his fingers the way music lives in a pianist who hasn't touched a keyboard in years. 8 years away from nursing. 8 years of mopping floors and loading warehouse pallets and fixing leaky faucets for cash under the table. And his hands remembered everything. He grabbed the EpiPen from the emergency medical kit, checked the dosage with a glance that lasted less than a second, positioned it against the woman's lateral thigh, and drove it home. 1, 2, 3. He held it there for 10 seconds, his lips moving silently through the count, while the cabin fell so quiet he could hear the engines humming their indifferent mechanical song beneath them. Color crept back into the woman's face like dawn spreading across a landscape that had gone dark. The steel bands around her ribs loosened. She gasped, a real gasp, the kind that sounds like the first breath after drowning, and coughed, and breathed. The cabin erupted in applause. The man in 3C kept filming. Nathan checked her pulse one final time, leaned close enough to smell the expensive perfume beneath the sour edge of adrenaline, and spoke quietly into her ear. Instructions. Professional. Precise. Second dose timing. Keep her upright. Paramedics at the gate. Do not let her fall asleep. The flight attendant touched his shoulder with a hand that was still shaking. The airline would want to recognize him. Could they get his name for the records? He was already standing, already moving, already gone. Back down the narrow aisle toward row 37, where a small girl clutched a one-eyed teddy bear against her chest and watched him with brown eyes that held more understanding than any child should carry. The woman he had saved struggled to lift her head. Through the chaos of crew members and concerned first-class passengers and one man still recording for his social media following, she caught a single glimpse. A faded jacket. Shoes held together with tape on the inside where nobody could see. A child's small hand reaching up to clasp a larger, rougher one. Then nothing. He dissolved into the back of the plane like smoke through a screen door. And by the time anyone thought to follow him, he had already become what he had spent 8 years perfecting: invisible. 35 minutes earlier, Nathan Mercer had been losing a war with a vending machine in the fluorescent purgatory of O'Hare International Airport. He punched B7 for the 3rd time. The granola bar hung there on the metal spiral, caught between falling and staying, mocking him with 60 cents worth of calories his body desperately needed. His last 60 cents until Friday, 3 days away. 3 days of creative hunger management and telling his daughter he wasn't hungry when she offered to share whatever small thing she had managed to save from yesterday's school lunch. Josie tugged his jacket with the gentle persistence of a child who has learned to read her father's silence the way other children read picture books. She held up half a Nature Valley bar, already crumbling between her small fingers, the wrapper carefully folded back so the crumbs wouldn't fall. She had been rationing it since yesterday morning without being told. 8 years old, and she already understood scarcity the way some people understand mathematics, instinctively, completely, without ever being formally taught. Captain Button says you should have his half. She squeezed the one-eyed teddy bear under her arm, a bear purchased from a hospital gift shop on the worst day of Nathan's life, a bear that had survived 6 apartments, 2 evictions, 1 shelter, and more nights on borrowed floors than either of them wanted to count. Nathan knelt down in the middle of the corridor while travelers streamed past them like water parting around 2 stones that the current couldn't move. He broke off a piece so small it barely qualified as food. Tell Captain Buttons, thank you. Josie's face brightened with the particular light that children carry when they believe they have done something important. He says, you're welcome. He also says, you need a haircut. Nathan almost smiled. Almost. The expression got halfway to his eyes before his phone buzzed in his pocket and killed it. Phoenix General Hospital. The caller ID alone was enough to make his stomach drop 6 inches. He already knew before answering. The way you know when the phone rings at 3 in the morning. The way you know when a doctor pauses too long before speaking. Dr. Patterson's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news they had delivered too many times to too many families in too many sterile hallways. His mother's condition had deteriorated significantly overnight, the word significantly doing the heavy lifting that the word dying was too honest to perform in a professional phone call. If he wanted to see her. The pause stretched long enough for Nathan to hear the hospital sounds behind it. The beeping monitors, the soft shuffle of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the ambient hum of machines keeping people alive who the world had decided weren't worth saving faster. Hours matter at this point, not days. 3 hours and 47 minutes. That was the flight time. 3 hours and 47 minutes to cross 2,000 miles and hold his mother's hand before she slipped into a silence that had no return address. He hung up. Josie was watching him with those eyes. Her mother's eyes. Brown and deep and far too perceptive for a child who still tucked a one-eyed teddy bear under her arm every morning like a soldier holstering a weapon. Is Grandma Ruth okay? She's waiting for us, baby. Let's go. Gate C19. Spirit Airlines, Flight 1847. The boarding area smelled like burnt coffee and quiet desperation. The ticket had cost $139, a number that represented 3 months of skipped lunches, a negotiation with the electric company that had ended with a payment plan he couldn't afford, and a conversation with his landlord that concluded with 2 words. 30 days. 30 days to produce 2 months of back rent or the eviction notice taped to his door would stop being a warning and start being a fact. But Ruth Mercer was dying in a hospital bed in Phoenix. She had raised him alone after his father walked out with a 23-year-old secretary and never looked back, never called, never sent a single birthday card across the 26 years and counting of his absence. Ruth had worked double shifts at Denny's for 19 years. Night shifts, holiday shifts. The shifts that nobody wanted because they fell on Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's Eve and every other moment that families were supposed to be together. She did it so her son could graduate from Rush University without the kind of debt that follows you like a shadow with interest rates. And when his wife Megan died, when the medical bills cratered through $800,000 and the bankruptcy lawyers started circling like vultures in sensible suits, Ruth sold her car, moved to Phoenix, downsized her entire life into a trailer park because that's what mothers do. They sell the car, they shrink the life, they show up. Now she was shrinking too, the cancer eating her from the inside like fire through paper. And Nathan had 3 hours and 47 minutes to say goodbye. Josie pulled his hand as they shuffled down the jetway. Daddy. Yeah, baby. Why do airplane tickets cost so much? Because they carry us to people we love. She processed this with the solemn gravity that only 8-year-olds possess, the kind of seriousness that adults lose somewhere between their first mortgage and their first compromise. The weight that disappears so gradually you don't notice until you reach for it one day and find it gone. Then love must be really expensive. Is that why we don't have very much? The question moved through him like a blade finding the gap between ribs. We have plenty of love, sweetheart. Just not plenty of money. They're different things. Her teacher, Miss Whitfield, says in America, they're the same thing. She says that's why her sister can't afford her medicine. Nathan had no answer for that. Some truths were too heavy for airport terminals and too sharp for a father whose daughter was already carrying more weight than any child should know existed. 2,000 miles east and 47 floors above a city that never stopped counting, Caroline Weston sat behind a desk that cost more than Nathan Mercer earned in a year. She hadn't slept either, but the architecture of her exhaustion was built from different materials. Bloomberg terminal cycling through pre-market futures, Wall Street Journal open, yellow highlighter marking paragraphs that would determine whether her week was a triumph or a catastrophe. Black coffee, no cream. She didn't have time for complications. Not in her coffee, not in her schedule, not in the spaces between the hours she had carved out of every day for 15 years, like a sculptor removing everything that wasn't the statue. Her phone rang at 5:14 in the morning. Her brother Dominic's voice carried that careful, measured concern that she had learned to translate years ago. It meant he was positioning. It meant he was calculating. It meant the man who had wanted her chair since the day she founded this company was sensing something in the air that smelled like opportunity. Board's getting restless about Q3 projections, sis. Some members are questioning leadership priorities. She could hear it beneath the words, the patient machinery of ambition turning gears that had been turning for 15 years, waiting for the moment she showed a crack wide enough to fit a knife. She hung up on him the way she had hung up on every threat to the thing she had built, quickly, cleanly, and without the satisfaction of explaining why. Dr. Helen Callister appeared in her doorway, 68 years old, silver-haired, the only human being on the planet who called Carolyn by her first name without first requesting permission. She asked when Caroline had last slept. The question carried the tone of a woman who already knew the answer and was asking only to establish a record for the argument she was about to make. Carolyn deflected with the fluency of someone who had been deflecting personal questions since before her company existed. Helen didn't smile. Your mother worked herself into an early grave. Heart attack at 51, alone in her office at 2 in the morning. You were 24. Don't make me watch history repeat itself. Caroline said nothing because there was nothing to say that Helen hadn't already heard, and nothing to promise that Caroline could keep. Her mother had left her one inheritance, not money, not property. Not the kind of thing that lawyers divide in conference rooms with good lighting. She left the bone-deep terror of poverty and an iron determination to never be weak, never be dependent, never be invisible again. Caroline had taken that inheritance and built walls so high that no one could see over them, and armor so thick that nothing could get through. She didn't know yet that armor could also become a prison, that the same walls that keep the world out can also keep you locked inside. Flight 1847 lifted off from O'Hare at 2:47 in the afternoon, carrying its cargo of separate lives towards separate destinations that neither could yet imagine would collide. In first class, Caroline reviewed IPO documents on a laptop that cost more than Nathan earned in 2 months. She declined the complimentary champagne, but accepted the shrimp appetizer her assistant had pre-ordered from the catering service. In row 37, Josie fell asleep against her father's shoulder with Captain Buttons clutched against her chest, exhausted from waking at 4 in the morning, from the bus to the train, from the train to the terminal, from carrying her backpack through corridors designed for people who traveled lighter than they did. Nathan stared out the window at a country passing beneath him in patches of brown and green and gray. His phone sat in airplane mode. For 3 hours and 47 minutes, his mother was alive because no one could tell him otherwise. The cruelest mercy altitude could offer. Somewhere below them, Ruth Mercer was measuring what she had left in breaths instead of days. And 35 minutes into the flight, the woman in first class who had never gone hungry, never taped her shoes, never split a granola bar with her daughter because it was the only food they had, stopped breathing. And the man in 37B, who had spent 8 years making himself invisible, stood up and walked toward her through a cabin full of people who had already decided it was someone else's problem. Josie watched him go with those brown eyes, her mother's eyes, holding Captain Buttons like a prayer. And when the woman gasped back to life and the cabin filled with applause, Josie pressed her face against the window and whispered something to the one-eyed bear that nobody else could hear. Then her father was back, sliding into the seat beside her, his hands steady, his face unreadable, his secret safe for now. She leaned into him, small and warm and certain. "You were good enough today, Daddy." He pulled her close and said nothing. Outside, the desert was rising to meet them, and somewhere down there, Ruth Mercer was counting minutes she no longer had. Nathan made it to Phoenix General with 11 minutes to spare. He ran through the lobby doors with Josie on his hip, her backpack slamming against his spine with every stride, Captain Buttons dangling from her fist like a flag carried into battle by the smallest soldier in the regiment. A nurse at the front desk opened her mouth to say something about visiting hours, but Nathan was already past her, already turning the corner toward the elevator bank, already counting the seconds the way he used to count them in the ICU when seconds were the currency that bought people more life. Room 714. He knew the number because he had called 6 times from the airport, each call a little shorter than the last, each answer a little more careful in its choice of words. The medical profession's gentle machinery for lowering expectations without ever saying the thing that everyone in the conversation already knew. The door was open. The machines were beeping in that slow, steady rhythm he recognized from 8 years of intensive care work. The rhythm that meant still here but barely. The rhythm that said hurry without raising its voice. Ruth Mercer lay in a bed that seemed to be consuming her. She had always been a big woman, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of woman who occupied space deliberately because the world had spent her entire life trying to compress her into something smaller and quieter and more convenient. Pancreatic cancer had done what the world could not. It had whittled her down to almost nothing. Her arms were thin as kindling, Her cheeks had collapsed inward. The hospital gown draped over her frame like a sheet thrown across a chair that nobody sat in anymore. Nathan set Josie down and pulled the bedside chair close enough to take his mother's hand without reaching. "Mom, I'm here. I made it." Her eyes opened, cloudy with morphine, but searching, always searching, the way they had searched for him in school auditoriums and graduation crowds and hospital waiting rooms for 38 years. They found him now the way they always found him, with a precision that no amount of medication or exhaustion or dying could diminish. Her voice came out like wind moving through dry grass. "You came? I told you I was coming. You always say that." A ghost of something that might have been a smile if she'd had the strength to complete it. "Half the time you mean it. I mean it every time. You just don't believe me because you're stubborn." She turned her head slightly, the movement costing her something visible, something that registered in the tightening around her eyes and the way her breath caught and held before releasing. "Where's my grandbaby?" Josie stepped forward with the ceremonial solemnity of a child who understands that this room is different from other rooms, that the air in here carries a weight that presses down on everything, that the beeping machines are not toys, and the tubes are not decorations. And the woman in the bed is someone she loves, who is becoming someone she will miss. She held up Captain Buttons with both hands like an offering. "Grandma Ruth, Captain Buttons wanted to see you. He was worried on the plane." Ruth's hand trembled as it reached for the bear, and Josie took it instead, wrapping her small fingers around her grandmother's with a grip that was gentle and fierce at the same time. The way you hold something precious that you know is slipping away. "Tell Captain Buttons I'm okay. Tell him Grandma's just tired. He knows. He's tired too. He fell asleep during the movie, but Daddy said there was no movie because we couldn't afford the headphones." Ruth's eyes shifted to Nathan. Something moved behind them that wasn't pity, because Ruth Mercer did not believe in pity, had never practiced it, would not begin practicing it now in the final hours of a life spent refusing to feel sorry for herself or anyone else. It was something deeper than pity, a knowing that had been building for 8 years, watching her son from 1,000 miles away, watching him shrink, watching him hide, watching the brightest thing she had ever created dim itself on purpose until it barely cast a shadow. She sent Josie to the chair by the window for grown-up talk. Josie went without protest, understanding the code, understanding that grown-up talk meant the words were going to be heavy, and the tears were going to come, and Captain Buttons would need to be brave for everyone. She placed the one-eyed bear on the bed beside Ruth's hand and retreated to the window where the Arizona sun was painting the last light of the day across the floor in long amber rectangles that would be gone before the conversation ended. Nathan leaned close. "Mom, what did the doctor say? And don't give me the version you gave me on the phone. I want the real one." Ruth opened her eyes fully for the first time since he'd arrived, and the morphine haze seemed to thin, as if the drug recognized that what was about to happen required clarity and had the decency to step aside. "The real one is, I'm dying, Nathan. Today, probably. Tomorrow, if I'm stubborn about it. And you know I'm stubborn about everything." He started to speak and she cut him off with a squeeze of his hand that contained more strength than her body should have been able to produce, a mother's grip, the same grip that had held him steady when he was 6 years old and crying in the doorway of their apartment because his father's car was pulling out of the driveway for the last time. "You've been hiding. 8 years, ever since Megan. You took yourself out of the world and you hid. And you think nobody noticed, but I noticed. I always noticed. He tried to protest. I didn't hide, Mom. I survived. I kept Josie fed. I kept the lights on. The words sounded thin, even to him. Paper walls erected against a storm that had been building since the night his wife died on a delivery table while he stood 3 feet away with the training to save her and the insurance company's hold music playing in his ear. Ruth's voice gathered something that sounded almost like anger, the productive kind, the kind that burns clean and leaves truth in its ashes. That's not living. That's existing. There's a difference. And you know it because you're too smart not to know it, which means you're choosing not to see it. And that's worse. She paused to breathe, and the pause cost her. And Nathan watched the cost register on the monitors beside her bed in numbers that were getting smaller by the hour. Megan would look at you right now. 3 jobs, no sleep, duct tape on your shoes. Don't think I didn't notice. And she would be furious. Not sad, Nathan. Furious. Because she married a man who was going to change the world. And that man is scrubbing toilets at midnight because he's too afraid to be a nurse again. The name Megan hit him in the chest the way it always hit him, like a fist wrapped in velvet. Soft enough to feel like tenderness and hard enough to crack something open that he had spent 8 years keeping sealed. He pulled his hand back. Don't. But Ruth was not a woman who stopped when she was told to stop. She had never been that woman. She would not become that woman in her final hours on Earth. Promise me something. Her voice was fading now, the volume dropping like a tide going out, but the current underneath was still strong enough to pull him under. Don't be afraid to live again. Not survive. Live. Find something. Find someone. Let yourself be seen. She broke then, tears sliding down cheeks that cancer had hollowed into geography he didn't recognize. The face of his mother remade by disease into something both familiar and foreign. Josie needs you whole, not just surviving. Whole. Can you do that for me? For her? Nathan closed his eyes and behind them saw Megan's face. Not the way she looked at the end, not the blood or the monitors or the hand going limp in his while the insurance authorization sat pending in some algorithm's queue for 47 minutes. He saw her the way she looked on their wedding day, laughing in the September light with wildflowers in her hair because she said roses were overpriced and lacked imagination. I promise, Mom. Say it like you mean it. He opened his eyes with tears on his face, mirroring hers. I promise. I'll try. Don't try. Do. There's a difference. You sound like a fortune cookie. I sound like your mother, and your mother is always right. He laughed, and the laugh came out broken and half a sob, but it was real, the first real laugh in this hospital. And Ruth smiled at the sound of it the way she used to smile when he was small, and said something clever, the smile that meant, there he is, there's my boy. And she whispered exactly that as the machines beeped and Josie hummed something soft by the window and the day's last light disappeared from the floor. At 7:42 in the evening, Ruth's breathing changed. Nathan recognized the pattern immediately because recognition was not a skill you could unlearn no matter how many years you spent trying. Cheney-Stokes respiration, the long pauses between breaths growing longer, the body's oldest machinery winding down in a rhythm that had no encore. He had heard it hundreds of times behind the curtains of the ICU. He had documented it in charts and explained it to families with clinical precision and held the hands of strangers while they listened to the same terrible metronome counting down someone they loved. This was different. This was his mother's breathing filling the room and emptying it and filling it less each time. He called Josie to him. She looked up from the window and read his face the way she always read it, fluently, without hesitation, without the luxury of pretending she didn't understand. She kissed Ruth's cheek and whispered something into her grandmother's ear that was too quiet for Nathan to hear, a secret between a dying woman and a child who believed that secrets could travel to places where the living could not follow. Nathan leaned close. "Mom, I'm here. I'm right here." Ruth's eyes opened one last time, and they were clear, startlingly, impossibly clear. The morphine haze burned away by something deeper and more ancient than any drug. "You kept your promise today. Keep it tomorrow. And the day after. And every day until you don't have to try anymore." "I will. I love you, Nathan. You were the best thing I ever did. I love you too, Mom." She smiled the way you smile when you have said everything that needs to be said, and the only thing left is the leaving. She closed her eyes, and between one breath and the next, between the beep and the silence that swallowed it, Ruth Mercer left the world the same way she had moved through it, quietly, on her own terms, without asking permission from anyone. The machines flatlined. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Nathan held up one hand. Just a moment, just one more moment, and the nurse waited because she had seen this before, and knew that some moments cannot be measured or rushed or interrupted without breaking something that will never heal correctly. He pressed his forehead against his mother's hand and stayed there while something inside him shifted, not broke, because he had been broken before, and this was not that. This was a wall coming down. A door opening into a room he had locked 8 years ago and sworn he would never enter again. Behind him, Josie's small voice crossed the silence like a candle carried through a dark house. Grandma Ruth told Captain Buttons a secret. Nathan turned. She was standing there with tears running down her cheeks and the one-eyed bear pressed against her heart. She said, "The secret is that you're brave." She said, "You just forgot." He picked up his daughter and held her against his chest and cried until the room blurred and the machines were just noise, and the only thing that was real was the weight of this child in his arms and the echo of his mother's voice telling him not to be afraid. 2,000 miles east, in a private suite at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Carolyn Weston lay connected to machines that confirmed what the man in seat 37B had already accomplished. She was alive. Her throat was raw from the intubation tube the paramedics had placed as a precaution when the plane landed. Her chest ached in places she didn't know could ache. Her hands trembled when she lifted them, and she could not make them stop, and the inability to control her own body frightened her more than the dying had. Helen Callister sat in the bedside chair reading a medical journal with the calm of a woman who had survived worse than watching someone she cared about nearly stop breathing at 30,000 feet. Caroline stared at the ceiling and told her about the man. "Someone saved my life on that plane. Sitting in the back, economy class. He pushed past the drink cart and dropped to his knees and put his hands on my face and told me I was going to be okay. And I believed him. I don't believe anyone." Helen set down her journal. 53 people on that plane, and one of them filmed you dying for content. Welcome to America. Caroline's voice thinned to something that sounded almost fragile, a word that had never before applied to anything about her. He saved me, used the EpiPen, monitored my vitals, gave the crew professional instructions. Calm, like he'd done it 1,000 times. And then he walked back to his seat and disappeared. He wasn't being humble. He was being invisible on purpose, like he'd practiced it. She hired Declan Byrne the next morning. Former FBI Chicago field office, $500 an hour. The kind of money that meant nothing to a woman worth $3 billion and everything to the man she was trying to find. 2 weeks of cross-referencing flight manifests with security footage, of running facial recognition through databases that Caroline chose not to ask about, of tracing boarding passes and cash transactions and emergency room admissions within 500 miles of Phoenix. The breakthrough came from the hospitals. A terminal cancer patient named Ruth Mercer, 67 years old, died the same evening as Flight 1847, next of kin listed as one person. Burns slid the dossier across his desk with the practiced neutrality of a man who had delivered worse news to worse people, and understood that the weight of information was best transferred without commentary. Carolyn opened the folder and read the life of the man who had saved hers. Former registered nurse, Bachelor of Science from Rush University, license still active but unemployed in healthcare since 2016. Current employment night custodian at Willis Tower, $12.75 an hour. No benefits. Warehouse associate at Amazon, $16.50 an hour, classified as seasonal for 14 consecutive months. Weekend handyman, cash basis, no records. She turned the page. Spouse, Megan Brennan Mercer. Deceased December 2016. Cause of death postpartum hemorrhage. Complications during childbirth. Medical debt incurred, $847,312. She turned another page. Daughter, Josie Grace Mercer, age 8, enrolled in free lunch program at Shields Elementary. Income qualified. Current bank balance $247.18. She set the folder down on the desk between them, and the number sat there like a scar that wouldn't close. The man who saved my $3 billion life has $247. She found him 8 days later in the parking lot of Phoenix General Hospital. She had canceled everything: the Deutsche Bank call, the board prep meeting, the IPO review session that her lawyers had spent 3 weeks arranging. She had flown 2,000 miles to stand in a hospital parking lot in Arizona heat that pressed down on everything like a hand trying to flatten the world. Nathan was standing beside an ancient Honda Civic with 251,000 miles on the odometer, staring at the driver's door with the emptied-out expression of a man who has run out of destinations. 73 hours without sleep had hollowed him into something that barely resembled the person who had saved her life with steady hands and absolute certainty 6 days ago. Her heels clicked on the asphalt. He turned. She watched his face move through recognition and confusion and settle on something close to irritation, the default setting of a man who had learned that when the world pays attention to you, it usually wants something. "I've been looking for you." His laugh scraped out of him like rust being stripped from metal. "You shouldn't have." She told him what he had done for her, and he dismissed it with the practiced deflection of someone who had stopped believing that his actions carried value. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. 53 people watched me die. One filmed it for TikTok. You were the only one who moved. The silence between them filled with parking lot wind pushing red dust across the asphalt, carrying the dry mineral smell of a desert that had no patience for pretense. His voice came out controlled at first, and then less controlled, and then not controlled at all. A bone fracturing along a line that had been cracked for 8 years. Guilt money? You feel bad that the guy who saved your billion-dollar life can't make rent? That my daughter qualifies for free lunch because I work 3 jobs and still can't break poverty level? He stepped closer, and she did not step back. I was a nurse, a good one. 8 years in the ICU saved hundreds of lives, and my wife bled out on a delivery table because some insurance algorithm needed 47 minutes to authorize a procedure that should have happened immediately. 47 minutes. I counted every single one. The system you built, the system that made you a billionaire, it killed my wife, bankrupted my family, and took the only career I ever loved. So forgive me if I'm not interested in your help. Caroline Weston looked at this man, exhausted and grieving and furious and proud, and she saw something she recognized the way you recognize your own reflection in a window you weren't expecting to pass. She saw herself 20 years younger, standing in a different parking lot after her mother's funeral, carrying the same fire and the same terror and the same desperate refusal to let anyone close enough to see that the fire was the only thing keeping the terror from winning. She did something she had not done in 42 years of building an empire out of fear and determination and black coffee with no room for cream. She sat down on the concrete curb, her $2,000 dress in the Arizona dirt, her designer heels scuffing against gravel that didn't care how much they cost. You're right, about everything. He stared at her because people did not sit in the dirt when they were worth $3 billion, and people did not agree with him when he was angry, and the combination of both was something his exhaustion could not process. She told him about her foundation's healthcare re-entry program, scholarships for nurses who left the field, housing assistance, childcare, full tuition, job placement, 3 years working in underserved communities, every penny earned, every certification passed, every patient served. Not charity, work. He told her about his mother's last words, the promise he had made, the fear he had carried for 8 years, like a stone in his chest that he couldn't put down, because putting it down would mean admitting it was there. She told him that she needed to believe the thing she built actually mattered for something beyond quarterly earnings and stock valuations and the relentless arithmetic of wealth. 2 people sitting on a curb at the edge of a hospital parking lot while the sun went down over Phoenix and painted the sky in colors that neither of them noticed because they were too busy looking at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with the 3 feet of concrete between them. Nathan extended his hand. Okay. Caroline took it. The same hand that had saved her life. The same hand she had hired a private investigator and flown 2,000 miles to find. They sat there while the last light drained from the sky, and the hospital behind them went on doing what hospitals do, cycling through the endless rotation of arrivals and departures, the living and the dying, and the people in between who hadn't yet decided which direction they were headed. And somewhere inside, a bed was being stripped and remade for the next person who needed saving. The foundation apartment had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a stove that worked on all 4 burners, and a front door that locked on the first try without needing to be kicked or shouldered or negotiated with like every door in every place they had lived for the past 3 years. Nathan stood in the middle of the living room holding a duffel bag in one hand and Josie's faded backpack in the other, and he did not move. He stood there the way a man stands at the edge of a lake he hasn't swum in since childhood, remembering the temperature, calculating the depth, wondering if the water still knows his name. Josie had no such hesitation. She dropped Captain Buttons on the couch and took off running down the hallway with the explosive energy of a child who has been holding herself still for so long that the release of it sounds like thunder in a small space. Daddy, there's a bathtub. A real bathtub. Not a shower with the broken handle. A bathtub. Her voice bounced off walls that were clean and painted and free of the watermarks and cracks that had decorated every ceiling she had ever slept under. She discovered the closet. A whole closet. Captain Buttons can have his own shelf. She discovered the second bedroom, and the discovery stopped her. She appeared in the hallway, breathless, her eyes enormous with something that looked like fear, because the distance between wanting something and having it can be so vast that the having feels dangerous, like standing on ground that might not hold. 2 bedrooms, Daddy. One for you and one for me. I don't have to sleep on the floor next to your mattress. No, Josie girl. You get your own room. She stared at him. She stared at the hallway. She stared at him again. And then she burst into tears with the full catastrophic force of an 8-year-old body processing a joy it has no experience holding. Not sad tears. Not scared tears. The kind that come when something you stopped believing in turns out to be real, and the shock of its reality is bigger than your capacity to contain it. Nathan knelt and pulled her close, and her voice came out in hiccups against his shoulder. I know it's okay. That's why I'm crying. Because it's okay, and I'm not used to things being okay. That first night after Josie fell asleep, really fell asleep, deep and dreamless in a real bed with real sheets and Captain Buttons on the pillow and her mother's photograph on the nightstand beside a lamp that turned on when you touched the switch. Nathan stood in her doorway and watched her breathe. He counted the breaths the way he used to count them in the ICU, except these breaths weren't data points or vital signs or entries in a medical chart. These breaths were the sound of his daughter feeling safe enough to let go completely, to surrender consciousness without checking first that the world would still be there when she came back. He cried standing in that doorway, not the way he had cried at the hospital when Ruth died, or the way he had cried in the parking lot when the shame of his poverty met the kindness of a stranger who sat in the dirt with him. He cried the way you cry when something clenched inside you for years finally releases, and you understand for the first time how much pain you were carrying, only because you can suddenly feel what it's like to set some of it down. He cried until he was empty, and then he sat at the kitchen table, opened the pharmacology textbook the program had issued, and started reading. The classes were brutal in the specific way that returning to something you were once great at and discovering the distance between then and now is brutal. 8 years away from nursing meant 8 years of new protocols, new medications, new technology, new ways of keeping people alive that hadn't existed when he left. The medical world had not waited for Nathan Mercer. It had sprinted ahead while he was on his knees, scrubbing grout from bathroom tiles at midnight, and catching up felt like running uphill in shoes held together with tape against a wind that kept changing direction. Pharmacology was the worst. He had been good at it once, top of his class at Rush, the student other students found in the library at 2 a.m. when they couldn't keep the drug interactions straight. Now the names blurred and merged and refused to stay organized in his memory. Metoprolol and carvedilol, lisinopril and losartan. Heparin drip calculations that used to flow through his fingers like water now took 40 minutes of staring at scratch paper while the coffee went cold, and the apartment went quiet. And the only sound was the pencil and his breathing, and the refrigerator humming behind its growing wall of sticky notes. 3 colors. Yellow for drug names, blue for dosages, pink for interactions. The refrigerator disappeared behind them within the first week. Josie added her own contributions between the pharmacological data, drawings of butterflies and hearts, and a stick figure wearing a stethoscope with the label "This one makes Daddy happy." Below it, in careful block letters, Captain Buttons says you can do it. 3 weeks into the program, Nathan failed a practice exam. Not by a margin that could be explained away or attributed to a bad night or a tricky question. 37%. The proctor handed the paper back with an expression that contained everything the score already communicated, and then some. Nathan sat in the foundation cafeteria at 11 o'clock at night with the exam face down on the table and his head in his hands, and thought about how simple it would be. Go back, return to the warehouses and the mop buckets and the 3-job rotation that ground him down, but never asked him to be more than invisible. That life was hard, but it was familiar. It had rhythms he recognized. Pain he had already mapped. It didn't require him to sit in a fluorescent cafeteria at 11 at night, confronting the possibility that the person he used to be no longer existed. His phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize. How was the exam? C. He stared at the screen. Caroline. He had not given her his number. Of course she had it. The woman had deployed a former FBI agent to locate a man in economy class. Acquiring a phone number was presumably something she accomplished between sips of the black coffee she was always drinking. He typed back one word. Fine. 3 dots appeared on the screen. Vanished appeared again. Liar. I talked to Dr. Reeves. He said you're struggling with the pharmacology module. Nathan's thumbs moved before his pride could stop them. You're checking up on me. A pause that lasted long enough to feel deliberate. I'm checking on you because I care. Is that allowed? He set the phone down, picked it up, set it down again. The cafeteria hummed around him with the particular emptiness of institutional spaces after hours, the sound of a building holding its breath. He picked the phone up a 3rd time and typed the number that was sitting on his chest like a stone. 37%. That's what I got. Her response came fast enough to tell him she had been waiting for honesty the way a doctor waits for a patient to stop minimizing symptoms. Okay. He waited for more. Okay, that's it? What do you want me to say? That it's over? That you should quit? You saved my life with skills you hadn't used in 8 years. You think a practice exam is the thing that stops you? The next message arrived before he could respond. People who waste time don't sit in cafeterias at 11 at night beating themselves up about a practice exam. They go home. You're still there. That tells me everything. He read it twice, 3 times. The words settled into the space between his ribs, where the 37% had been sitting and rearranged something, not fixed it, rearranged it, made room for the possibility that the number on the exam was not the number that defined him. He asked her why she cared, really cared, not the foundation answer, not the public relations answer, the actual reason. The 3 dots appeared and stayed for almost a full minute, long enough for Nathan to imagine her sitting somewhere expensive and sleepless, staring at her own phone the way he was staring at his, trying to find words for something that words were not quite built to carry. Because you're the first person in 20 years who saw me as a human being and not a number on a balance sheet. And I'd like to return the favor. He put the phone down, opened the textbook, read the chapter again. 37 became 61 on the next practice exam. 61 became 74. 74 became 89. The sticky notes on the refrigerator multiplied until Josie started adding drawings between them, hearts and butterflies, and a portrait of Captain Buttons wearing a nurse's cap with the inscription, "He believes in you, Daddy," written in purple crayon that bled slightly at the edges the way crayon does when pressed too hard by a hand that means every stroke. Caroline appeared in Nathan's life the way weather changes in early spring, gradually enough that you don't notice the shift until one morning you step outside and realize the air is different. She brought coffee during late study sessions. Not the kind of coffee that came in cups with logos and cost $6. Gas station coffee, black, $2. Because he had mentioned once in passing that he didn't trust coffee that required a menu, and she had filed that information in whatever part of her brain stored the details of people she had decided mattered. She helped Josie with homework when Nathan had clinical rotations, sitting cross-legged on the apartment floor with a third grader's math worksheet spread between them, discovering with genuine alarm that she could not remember how to carry the two. Josie regarded her with the benevolent condescension of a child correcting an adult. "Miss Caroline, you're doing it wrong." Caroline's response carried the bewildered dignity of a woman confronting the limits of a degree that had cost more than Nathan's apartment. "I run a $4 billion company." Josie was unmoved. "Then why can't you carry the two?" The question hung in the air with the perfect logic of childhood, unanswerable, not because it was unfair, but because it was exactly fair. Because it pointed at the gap between the things the world rewards and the things that actually matter, with the precision of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend the gap doesn't exist. Neither Nathan nor Caroline named what was growing between them. They circled it with the careful deliberation of two people who have both held something precious and watched it shatter and now approach anything breakable with their hands behind their backs. Late-night text messages that were not romantic and not flirtatious and not anything that either of them would have needed to explain to anyone, and yet contained a frequency of attention that neither could pretend was casual. "How's the studying?" "Josie lost another tooth. That's 4 this year." "Board meeting ran late." "Dominic was insufferable. Tell me something good." Josie drew a picture of a stethoscope today and labeled it "Daddy's Magic Listener." She thinks I use it to hear people's secrets. Caroline's reply arrived 20 seconds later. "That might be the best thing anyone has told me in 15 years. Across town, in a corner office that smelled like cologne and ambition, Dominic Weston was looking at photographs. Not the kind you frame and put on a desk to project warmth you don't possess. Surveillance photographs. Caroline's car parked outside Nathan's apartment building at 11:43 at night. The two of them walking through Humboldt Park on a Saturday afternoon, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. Occupying the charged space between proximity and contact that tells you everything about where a relationship is headed. Dominic spread the photographs across his mahogany desk and studied them with the patience of a man who has been waiting 15 years for exactly this kind of opening. His sister had finally let someone through the walls she had spent her entire adult life constructing. That someone was a bankrupt former janitor enrolled in her own foundation's charity program. The optics were a gift wrapped in a bow. He made a phone call. By Thursday, the photographs had reached a financial tabloid that specialized in the kind of stories that didn't need to be true to cause damage, only plausible. The headline bloomed across the internet with the viral efficiency of accusation. CEO's secret relationship with foundation recipient, conflict of interest questions mount. The article didn't name Nathan directly, but described him with enough specificity that anyone with a search engine and 10 minutes could connect the dots. A former janitor. A bankrupt single father. Fast-tracked through the company's own re-entry program while the CEO personally supervised his progress. Board members called. Donors called. The foundation's communications director called 3 times in 1 hour. Carolyn traced the leak as far as the tabloid's anonymous source, but couldn't prove it led to Dominic, not yet. and Dominic was counting on that gap between suspicion and evidence, the same gap he had been operating in for 15 years, close enough to the line to exert pressure, but never quite crossing it. Nathan saw the article on his phone while sitting in the cafeteria between study blocks. He read it twice, and the second reading hit harder than the first because the first time you read something that reduces your life to a headline, you are still processing the shock, and the second time, you are processing the shame. The instinct to run fired through his nervous system with the speed and certainty of a reflex, the same reflex that had governed his life for 8 years, the reflex that said disappear, shrink, make yourself so small that the world's attention passes over you the way light passes over something that casts no shadow. But Josie was sleeping in her own room for the first time in her life, and Ruth's voice played in his memory with the clarity of something recorded and preserved. Don't be afraid. 4 months into the program, Nathan arrived at Cook County Medical Center for his first clinical rotation, and his body tried to leave before his mind could stop it. The ICU doors opened and the smell hit him first. Antiseptic and recycled air and the particular metallic undertone that blood leaves in spaces where it has been spilled and cleaned and spilled again. Then the sounds. Heart monitors beeping in patterns he could still read without thinking. Ventilators pushing air into lungs that couldn't manage the job alone. The soft, rhythmic hissing of oxygen delivery systems. And underneath all of it, woven through the machinery and the medicine and the institutional efficiency of organized survival, the memory that he had been running from for 8 years. Megan's face, the blood, the flatline, her hand going limp in his while the authorization sat pending. His hands started shaking, not the subtle tremor that exhaustion produces or the minor vibration of nerves before a performance. A full-body tremor that began in his fingertips and worked its way through his wrists and forearms and into his shoulders until his whole frame was vibrating like a tuning fork struck against the thing it feared most. Dr. Grace Holloway was watching from across the nursing station. 30 years in the ICU had built her into someone who could assess a person's condition from 50 feet away without appearing to look, a skill that had less to do with medicine than with the accumulated instinct of 3 decades spent in rooms where things went wrong fast. "Mercer, you good?" The question carried no judgment and no sympathy, just a clean professional inquiry that expected a clean professional answer. "I'm good." "Your hands say otherwise." "My hands need a minute." "Take 2. But then, I need you." On bed 4. Bed 4 held Ray Donnelly, a retired mechanic from Bridgeport, 67 years old, fresh from triple bypass surgery, and absolutely convinced he needed to get to his shop because someone named Hennessy was bringing a Buick in at 8, and the transmission was shot. Nathan talked him down with the steady patience of someone who understood that confused post-surgical patients needed a voice more than they needed information. He checked vitals, adjusted the drip rate, documented numbers in the chart. His hands were steady because the patient needed them steady, and his body remembered that obligation before his fear could overrule it. Ray squinted at him with the frank appraisal of a man who had spent his life reading engines and had decided to apply the same diagnostic approach to the nurse standing beside his bed. "You look tired." "I am tired." "Then sit down. You're making me nervous, standing there, like you're about to fall over." They talked about transmissions and hearts and the way everything mechanical or biological is connected to everything else. You pull one thing, something else moves. You got to know which part to touch and which part to leave alone. Nathan laughed, and the sound surprised him because it came from somewhere that hospitals had made inaccessible for 8 years, a place behind the grief and the guilt and the memory of monitors screaming, a place where it was still possible to sit beside a stranger and find something funny in the machinery of being alive. At 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday, Caroline found him in the cafeteria. Pharmacology final in 6 hours. He had read the chapter 9 times, and the words were swimming. She sat across from him in jeans and a Yale sweatshirt, no makeup, no armor, more human than he had ever seen her. She asked him to tell her about Megan. The request dropped into the silence between them like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread in every direction at once. 8 years of silence met the 3 a.m. Vulnerability that strips away every defense a person has built and leaves only the raw architecture of who they actually are. She taught kindergarten, special ed, kids with learning differences, behavioral challenges, the ones nobody else had patience for. She'd come home covered in finger pain and glitter, telling me about some 5-year-old who said his first full sentence. She got pregnant with Josie. Easy pregnancy, no complications. We painted the nursery yellow because she said yellow was the color of optimism, and our daughter was going to be an optimist whether she liked it or not. His voice caught on the next part the way it always caught. The hinge between before and after, the moment where the story pivots from a life being built to a life being destroyed. Then the delivery. Everything went wrong at once. Placental abruption. Massive hemorrhage. I was there. I was a nurse. I knew exactly what was happening. But I wasn't her doctor. I was her husband. I had to stand there and watch while they waited for insurance authorization. 47 minutes. I counted every one. By the time they approved it, she looked at me. Blood everywhere. Monitors screaming. And she whispered, "Take care of our Josie. Promise me." Then her hand went limp. Carolyn covered his hand with hers across the table, littered with flashcards and cold coffee. Their fingers interlaced and neither pulled away, and the gesture was not romantic and not platonic, but something that exists in the space between categories where two people who have both been broken recognize each other's fracture lines without needing a map. Megan would have liked you. She liked people too stubborn to quit. She used to say stubbornness was just courage that hadn't learned manners yet. Nathan passed the pharmacology final with an 87. 2 weeks later, his first code blew. Dorothy Ashburn, 62 years old. Cardiac arrest during a routine post-surgical check. The alarm sounded and Nathan froze. Half a second, the monitors screamed and the sound was the same sound, the exact same frequency and rhythm and mechanical urgency. And for half a second, he was standing in a delivery room, watching his wife die while the world asked him to wait. Half a second. Then he moved. Compressions. Airway management. Defibrillator charged and positioned with hands that had forgotten how to hesitate. Dorothy Ashburn came back. Her heart restarted, and Nathan stood beside her bed with his hands steady and his breath even, and the knowledge that 8 years of running had not erased a single thing his body knew how to do when someone needed saving. Holloway found him in the break room afterward. "You froze for about half a second when the alarm went off. I saw it." Nathan met her eyes. "I know. But then you moved." Fastest response time I've seen from a returning nurse. Maybe fastest I've seen, period. He told her about the old monitors, the old sounds, the delivery room that still played behind his eyes every time a machine screamed that someone was dying. She asked why it didn't stop him. He thought about it with the honesty that only comes after you've done the thing you were afraid of and discovered that the fear didn't disappear. but you moved through it anyway. Because I'm not the same person I was the last time I heard that sound. That man was alone. I'm not alone anymore." Holloway nodded once, the closest thing to approval she had given anyone in the years that the staff had been counting. "Welcome back, Mercer." The words settled into him like rain into ground that has been dry so long it has forgotten what moisture feels like. He stood in the break room of Cook County Medical Center and felt something shift in the architecture of who he was. Not a dramatic transformation, not a cinematic moment of rebirth, but a quiet structural adjustment. A load-bearing wall moved an inch to the left. A door rehung so it opened instead of staying shut. He was still broken. He would always be broken. But broken things can hold weight if the brakes are in the right places. And Nathan Mercer was beginning to learn where his brakes could bear the most. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see from inside the small bright circle of his own becoming, was that 2 miles away in a corner office, Dominic Weston was picking up his phone again. The tabloid story had been a reconnaissance mission. The gala was 3 weeks away. 500 guests, donors, board members, press, and Dominic was spreading photographs across his desk the way a general spreads maps before an assault. Studying the terrain, identifying the weakness, calculating the exact angle of approach that would cause the maximum structural damage to the person who had kept him from the only thing he had ever wanted. He had been waiting 15 years. 3 weeks was nothing. 2 weeks before the gala, Josie found Carolyn alone on the foundation playground, swinging half-heartedly on a swing built for someone who weighed 60 pounds and believed that momentum was a form of magic. Caroline's feet dragged against the wood chips with each pass, her body committing to the motion without her heart following. The posture of a woman who had climbed to the top of everything the world said mattered and discovered that the view from up there was mostly just distance from everyone below. Josie stood in front of her holding Captain Buttons under one arm and a juice box in the other with the quiet authority of a child who has assessed a situation and determined that adult intervention is required. "Do you know how to swing?" Caroline looked down at the 8-year-old evaluating her technique with the critical eye of an expert confronting amateur work. "I used to. I think I forgot." Josie demonstrated the proper method, the lean, the kick, the timing that transforms a metal chain and a rubber seat into a machine for touching the sky. Carolyn attempted it and nearly fell off. Josie laughed with the full-body commitment of a child who has witnessed something genuinely hilarious. Laughed until juice came out of her nose, which made her laugh harder, which made Caroline laugh too. And for a moment, the playground held two people who had forgotten what it felt like to be ridiculous and were remembering together. Then Josie got serious. The transition happened the way weather changes in the mountains. Without warning, without apology, the laughter dropping away to reveal something underneath that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. "Miss Caroline, can I ask you something important?" The word important carried the weight of a child who has learned that some questions change the shape of the conversation they land in. Caroline told her anything. "Do you like my daddy?" Like him? The question arrived with the surgical precision of someone who has been thinking about it for weeks and has decided that the direct approach is the only approach worth taking. Because he talks about you a lot. He says you're brave and smart, and you see people that other people don't see. He says you saw him when everyone else looked right through him like he was a window instead of a person. Caroline's breath stopped in her chest, the way breath stops when something true lands in a place you've been protecting. Josie continued with the relentless momentum of a child who has started saying the important thing and will not stop until all of it has been said. "Only if you're not going to leave." Because Mommy left, and Grandma Ruth left, and I don't want Daddy to be sad again. He thinks I don't hear him at night, but I do. He sits in the kitchen after I go to sleep, and he gets really quiet, and I know he's crying because the chair makes that sound when he puts his head on the table. Carolyn knelt to Josie's level because what was about to be said needed to be said eye to eye, woman to child, across the distance that grief creates between people who have both lost enough to know that promises are the most dangerous things you can make and the most necessary. Josie, I would never hurt your daddy on purpose. Not ever. Josie's face didn't soften. That's what Mommy said too, but she still left. Your mommy didn't choose to leave, sweetheart. She wanted to stay more than anything in the world. How do you know? Because any mother who had you would never want to go. Josie searched her face with those eyes, Megan's eyes, brown and deep, and reading everything the way you read a contract before signing it, looking for the loopholes, testing the language, determining whether the person across from you means what they're saying or is just arranging words in a pattern that sounds like meaning. The examination lasted long enough for Caroline to feel something she hadn't felt in the boardrooms and negotiations and high-stakes confrontations that had defined her adult life. She felt seen, not evaluated, not assessed, not measured against a metric. Seen by an 8-year-old girl with juice on her chin and a one-eyed teddy bear under her arm. Okay, I believe you. Josie wrapped her arms around Caroline's neck and held on with the fierce desperation of a child who is choosing to trust and knows exactly how much that choice can cost. But, Miss Caroline, if you make Daddy cry, I'll be really, really mad. Something unlocked in Caroline's chest that she hadn't known was closed. A door she hadn't known existed in a room she hadn't known she was standing in. Deal. The night of the gala arrived the way all dreaded things arrive. Too slowly while you're watching the calendar, and too quickly when you look up and it's here. Nathan stood in front of the bathroom mirror, and the face looking back at him belonged to someone he was still learning to recognize. Charcoal gray Italian wool, tailored in ways that no piece of clothing had ever fitted him before. The suit a gift from Caroline that she described as a program requirement for formal events. A lie they both recognized and neither challenged, because some lies are just kindness, wearing a disguise. He adjusted the tie for the 6th time. His hands, steady enough to defibrillate a stopped heart, steady enough to find a pulse at 30,000 feet, could not make a Windsor knot behave. Josie sat on the edge of the bathtub with Captain Buttons in her lap, watching him fail with the patient exasperation of a child who has witnessed her father's incompetence at basic life tasks too many times to count. Daddy, you're doing it wrong. She stood on the toilet lid, grabbed both ends of the tie, and pulled them into something that was technically a knot. Not a Windsor. Not a half Windsor. Something new, something asymmetrical and lopsided and structurally dubious that had never existed before in the history of neckwear and would never exist again because it could only be created by the specific combination of an 8-year-old's determination and a complete absence of formal training. There. Perfect. It was crooked. The narrow end hung 2 inches below the wide end. The knot itself appeared to be attempting to escape in 2 directions simultaneously. It was perfect. He told her not to touch it. She instructed him on dancing protocol using Captain Buttons as a demonstration partner, waltzing the one-eyed bear across the bathroom counter with the gravitas of a choreographer preparing a student for the performance of his life. And then you look into her eyes and say something nice. Like what? Like you're pretty, or I like your dress, or thank you for not being mean to my daughter. That last one is very specific. Tommy Baker's dad's girlfriend is mean to him. She makes him eat broccoli without cheese. That is mean. So make sure Miss Caroline knows I appreciate her. Mrs. Pritchard arrived at 7. Nathan kissed Josie goodbye and stood at the front door for a full minute without opening it, his hand on the knob, his body conducting an internal referendum on whether walking through this door was an act of courage or an act of foolishness, knowing that the difference between the two is usually only visible in retrospect. His phone buzzed. "I'm in the car downstairs. You have 3 minutes before I come up there and drag you out. I'm coming. You've been standing at the door for 90 seconds. I can see your shadow. How can you see my shadow from the car?" "I can't. But I know you, Nathan. Open the door." He opened the door. The Four Seasons Grand Ballroom held 500 people, and every single one of them made Nathan feel like he was wearing a costume over the person he actually was. Layers of disguise that no amount of Italian wool could make convincing. Donors in diamonds. Board members in suits that cost what he used to earn in 3 months. Politicians with handshakes calibrated to communicate net worth through grip pressure alone. Caroline walked beside him in a navy Valentino gown, the CEO version of herself reassembled for public consumption, the billion-dollar edition that commanded rooms and terrified competitors. But she had held his hand in the car, briefly, silently. The way you hold something when you want the other person to know you understand how hard this is without making them talk about how hard this is. Helen Callister found them near the bar. She looked at Nathan with the measuring gaze of a woman who had spent 4 decades reading people's vital signs at a glance and had decided to apply the same diagnostic precision to the man standing next to her boss. "So you're the one who saved her stubborn life and then had the audacity to disappear. She doesn't let people in. You're the first person who got through the door. And I've been trying for 20 years. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Nathan met her eyes with the honest bewilderment of someone who genuinely did not understand what he had done to earn the position he was standing in. "I'm not doing anything." Exactly. That's why it's working. The evening progressed through its choreographed stages. Speeches and toasts and foundation updates delivered in the polished language of institutional philanthropy that transforms human suffering into bullet points and real impact into presentation slides. Nathan stood at the edges, watching, listening, feeling the distance between himself and every other person in the room, the way you feel cold air leaking through a crack in a window that looks sealed but isn't. Then Dominic Weston took the stage, and the temperature in the room changed the way temperature changes when a door opens onto a different climate. Nathan didn't know Dominic. He had heard the name from Caroline in passing, her brother, the word brother, always carrying a weight that suggested the relationship was more complicated than biology. Dominic tapped the microphone and the ballroom quieted with the trained obedience of an audience that recognizes authority even when it hasn't earned it. Before we continue with tonight's festivities, I have some concerns about foundation operations that I believe must be addressed publicly. Caroline's hand tightened on her champagne glass. Nathan watched her knuckles go white and understood in that instant that whatever was coming, she had feared it long enough for the fear to have developed roots. The screen behind Dominic illuminated. Photographs. Nathan and Caroline in the foundation cafeteria. Heads bent over textbooks at 3 a.m. Her car outside his apartment building at 11:43 at night. The two of them walking through Humboldt Park, shoulders almost touching. The charged proximity of two people pretending the space between them is casual. The air in the ballroom shifted. 500 people inhaled at the same time. Dominic's voice carried the rehearsed concern of a man who has practiced sounding worried until the performance became indistinguishable from the real thing. A former custodian, a man who abandoned his medical career 8 years ago, fast-tracked through our foundation's re-entry program while more qualified candidates wait in line, given housing, tuition, childcare, benefits worth over $175,000, all while my sister personally supervises his progress. Phones rose throughout the ballroom, recording, capturing, already composing the captions that would carry this moment beyond these walls and into the machinery of public judgment. I'm not suggesting anything improper. The pause after the sentence said everything the sentence didn't. I'm simply asking whether this is an appropriate use of foundation resources, or whether our CEO has confused philanthropy with personal interest. 500 pairs of eyes turned to Nathan. He felt each one of them the way you feel a spotlight, hot and blinding and exposing every crack and patch and piece of tape you've used to hold yourself together. Wealthy eyes, polished eyes, eyes that had never taped their shoes or split a granola bar or sat in a vending machine corridor at O'Hare trying to decide if 60 cents was worth spending on food when your daughter was already rationing hers. The distance between first class and row 37 had followed him here. It was standing in this ballroom wearing a suit that didn't belong to him, surrounded by people whose compassion was a line item on their tax returns. And the distance was not measured in rows or dollars, but in something more permanent, something that no scholarship or foundation apartment could bridge. Nathan set his glass down. The movement was quiet and deliberate and final, the gesture of a man who has reached a conclusion and will not be argued out of it. He walked toward the exit, not running, too proud to run, but each step was a withdrawal, a pulling back of something that had only recently been extended, the tentative reaching out of a man who had spent 8 years with his arms at his sides now folding them back against his body, where they were safe. Carolyn's voice reached him, low and urgent. Nathan. He did not look at her, because looking at her would mean seeing the one person who had ever seen him, and the shame of being seen like this, exposed and weaponized and converted into evidence of her poor judgment, would break something that was still too new and too fragile to survive that kind of pressure. He pushed through the ballroom doors into the Chicago night, where the cold hit his face, and the city swallowed the sound of a world he had been foolish to believe would ever open its doors to a man from row 37. He drove home in the Honda Civic and sat in the dark with his hands on the steering wheel and Megan's ring heavy on the chain around his neck, and the silence filling the car the way water fills a space that has nowhere to drain. He had been right all along. The parking lot in Phoenix, the apartment, the program, the late-night coffee, and the homework help, and the way she laughed when Josie said something outrageous. A detour. A beautiful, impossible detour from a life that was always going to circle back to the same coordinates. Invisible. Economy class. Row 37. Small footsteps in the hallway. Daddy. Go back to bed, Josie. She didn't. She came down the hall in her astronaut cat pajamas, the ones Caroline had bought her, and climbed onto the couch beside him the way she had climbed onto every surface he had occupied for 8 years, fitting herself against him like a component designed for exactly this configuration. You're sad, I can tell. Your voice gets small. Miss Caroline called while you were driving. She talked to Mrs. Pritchard, but I was listening from the hallway. No apology for eavesdropping. Josie considered information a public utility. She said a mean man said bad things about you in front of everyone. She said he's a liar and she's going to fix it. She was crying, Daddy. I could hear it in her voice. But she was also really mad. Like the time I spilled grape juice on Mr. Donnelly's chart and Dr. Holloway got that quiet voice that's scarier than yelling. Josie closed her eyes and recited the message with the precision of a child who understands that these particular words must be delivered exactly as they were spoken, because they are the kind of words that only work if they arrive intact. She had made Mrs. Pritchard write them down, but she remembered anyway, because it's the kind of thing you remember. The invisible man was never invisible to me. Tell him I see him. Tell him I've always seen him. And tell him I'm not going anywhere. The apartment was so quiet that Nathan could hear the refrigerator humming behind its wall of sticky notes and butterfly drawings and pharmacology charts and crayon portraits of a family that was still under construction. Something cracked in his chest, not broke, ice shifting, a frozen river hearing the first sounds of spring and not knowing yet whether to trust them. Then Josie started coughing, not a normal cough. Deep, wheezing, the sound of airways constricting like fists closing around the passages that carried air to her lungs. Her chronic asthma, usually managed with the inhaler that Nathan kept in 3 locations because redundancy was the only insurance he could afford, was flaring with a severity that the stress of the evening and the cold apartment air and the late hour had conspired to produce. The cough deepened. Her breathing thinned. Her lips began to change color in the dim light of the living room, and Nathan's training displaced his grief with the mechanical efficiency of a system designed to override every other function when a life is at risk. He grabbed the inhaler from the kitchen drawer, administered it, waited. The medication hit her lungs and did nothing. Her chest heaved, and the wheeze became a whistle, became something that sounded less like breathing and more like a door being forced shut against a wind that was trying to get through. Daddy, I can't. Breathe. Her eyes were wide and terrified and looking at him with the absolute faith of a child who believes her father can fix anything, even the air, even the invisible machinery of her own body turning against her. Nathan recognized what was happening with the clinical precision that 8 years of distance had not diminished. Severe asthma exacerbation progressing towards status asthmaticus. She needed a hospital, and she needed it now, and every second between this moment and the moment she was connected to a nebulizer was a second he could not afford to waste on the luxury of fear. He carried her to the Honda Civic at a dead run. Josie in his arms, Captain Buttons clutched in fingers that were white with the effort of holding on to the only thing she could control. He drove to Cook County with his daughter gasping in the back seat, and the irony was not lost on him that 3 hours ago he had been standing in a ballroom surrounded by people worth billions, and now he was racing through Chicago in a car with 250,000 miles on it, trying to keep his daughter breathing. And the distance between those two realities was the entire story of his life, compressed into a single night. The emergency room stabilized Josie with the efficient urgency of a system that works best when the situation is worst. Nebulizer treatment, supplemental oxygen, intravenous steroids that entered her bloodstream and began the slow work of convincing her lungs to open again. The attending physician assured Nathan she would be fine by morning, but she was staying overnight, and the word overnight landed on him with the weight of every overnight he had ever spent in a hospital. Every night sitting beside a bed, listening to machines measure what was left of someone he loved. He sat beside her bed in the gala suit with Josie's crooked tie still knotted at his throat, holding her small hand while the monitors beeped their familiar rhythm, the same rhythm, always the same rhythm. And he wondered if there would ever come a time when the sound of a heart monitor didn't make him feel like he was standing in two hospitals at once, the one where his daughter was recovering and the one where his wife had died. Josie surfaced from the medication fog just enough to find his eyes. "Daddy, I'm here, baby. Don't leave. Never. Promise? Pinky, promise." She extended her pinky from beneath the hospital blanket, small and pale and trembling slightly from the steroids, and he locked his around it and held on. 20 minutes later, Caroline appeared in the doorway, still in the Valentino gown. Mascara tracked down both cheeks in dark lines that mapped the distance between the woman who had stood in a ballroom defending her company and the woman standing here now with her shoes in her hand and her armor in pieces on the floor somewhere between the lobby and this room. She didn't speak. She sat in the chair on the opposite side of Josie's bed and took the child's other hand, and the three of them formed a circuit that the monitors couldn't measure, a current running between them that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the particular electricity of people who have decided to stay. Josie opened one eye. "Hi, Miss Caroline." "Hi, sweet girl. Your dress is really pretty. Thank you. Daddy was supposed to tell you that at the party. He can tell me later." "Are you staying?" "I'm staying." "Good. Captain Buttons was worried you wouldn't come." The eye closed. The monitors beeped. The night passed with the three of them bracketing a hospital bed in a room that smelled like antiseptic and the particular variety of fear that only parents know. The fear that is not for yourself, that is never for yourself, that exists entirely in the space between your body and the small body you would trade everything to protect. The next morning, Josie was discharged with the resilient bounce back of a child whose body heals faster than the adults around her can process the scare. Nathan took her home and found waiting for him something that Ruth had left behind and that Mrs. Pritchard had been keeping among his mother's belongings. A small wooden box, hand-carved. The box Ruth had kept her own wedding ring in after Nathan's father left. A container for the things that mattered most, stored inside a life that had been stripped down to the things that mattered least. Inside the box was a letter. Not Ruth's handwriting, Megan's. The sight of her penmanship hit him in the chest the way a sound can hit you, not through the ears, but through the body. A physical impact that bypasses every defense you've built because it arrives from a direction you forgot to guard. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Josie was born. Megan had given it to Ruth with instructions that Ruth had followed for 8 years with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that timing is everything and that some messages can only be received by someone who is ready to hear them. He read it at the kitchen table surrounded by the pharmacology notes and the butterfly stickers and the crayon drawings and the sticky notes in 3 colors that covered the refrigerator like a map of everything he had been building since the day he sat on a curb in Arizona and shook a stranger's hand. Nathan, if you're reading this, something happened. I don't know what, but I wrote this letter because pregnancy made me philosophical and slightly paranoid. And because I want you to hear my voice one more time after it's gone. Here's what I know. You're going to blame yourself. You're going to think you should have done more, been more, saved me from whatever took me away. Stop. That's not who you are. You're not the man who saves one person. You're the man who saves everyone, and the only person you'll ever forget to save is yourself. So here's my last prescription. Nurse Hottie. Live. Not survive. Live. Find someone who makes you laugh at 3 a.m. and argue about shampoo and burn pancakes on Sunday mornings. Someone who sees you, really sees you, not the version you show the world to keep people at a safe distance. And take care of our Josie. Tell her I loved her before I ever met her. Tell her yellow is the color of optimism. Tell her her mother was stubborn and imperfect and wildly, completely in love with the idea of her. Don't let me be the end of your story, Nathan. I'm just one chapter. A really good chapter. But the book isn't finished. I love you. I love you. I love you. Yours, but willing to share. Megan, P.S. If the shampoo at home is anything less than professional grade, I will haunt you. Nathan folded the letter and pressed it against his chest in the space where Megan's ring used to hang, and made a sound that was not crying and not laughing, but something that exists only in the territory where grief meets gratitude, where the pain of losing someone and the gift of having had them occupy the same square inch of a person's heart and press against each other until the pressure produces something that has no name but feels like being alive. He stood up, looked at the refrigerator, looked at Captain Buttons on the couch, looked at Josie's bedroom door with its stickers and its sign that read, "Josie's room and Captain Buttons, knock first." He picked up his phone. I'm coming back, not to the program, to everything. I'm done hiding. Caroline's response arrived in 4 seconds. I know. I've been waiting. How did you know before I did? Because Josie told me. She said Captain Buttons had a feeling. He set the phone down and sat for a long time in the quiet kitchen while the refrigerator hummed and the sticky notes fluttered in the vent breeze. And somewhere in the next room, his daughter slept with a one-eyed bear and the unshakable conviction that her father was brave and had simply forgotten, and was now, finally, beginning to remember. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 in the morning in a conference room that smelled like leather and anxiety and the particular tension that fills a space when the people inside it know that what happens in the next hour will determine whether careers survive or collapse. Dominic arrived first. He sat at the head of the table in Carolyn's chair with his legs crossed and his suit pressed to a crispness that suggested he had spent more time preparing his appearance for this meeting than preparing his conscience, which required no preparation at all because it had been operating without interference for 15 years. Board members filed in with the careful choreography of people who have read the morning headlines and have not yet decided which side of the wreckage to stand on. The photographs from the gala had migrated overnight through 3 news sites and 17 social media accounts with a viral efficiency of scandal, each repost adding a layer of commentary that moved further from fact and closer to narrative until the story being told bore only a passing resemblance to anything that had actually happened. Foundation donors were calling. The communications team was drowning. Dominic's gambit had performed exactly as engineered. Helen Callister entered and sat down without looking at Dominic. Her fury was the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need volume because it operates at a frequency that makes the molecules in the air rearrange themselves around it. Then Caroline walked in carrying a folder thick enough to change the weather in the room. She set it on the conference table, and the sound it made when it landed caused 2 board members to flinch, which told her everything she needed to know about where their loyalties had been leaning before she arrived. She had slept 2 hours. She had spent the remaining 6 on the phone with lawyers, forensic accountants, and a woman at the Securities and Exchange Commission whose name Dominic would learn soon enough and remember for considerably longer than he wanted to. Dominic began adjusting his cuffs with the performative calm of a man who believes the script is still going according to plan. Caroline, I think we all understand why this meeting was called. The board has serious concerns. Caroline cut him off without raising her voice, which was worse than raising her voice because it meant she had moved past anger into something colder and more precise. The temperature at which decisions are made without the interference of emotion. The board has concerns, Dominic. Or you have concerns. The distinction matters. Because what I have in this folder isn't about concerns. It's about criminal activity. She opened the folder the way a surgeon opens a patient, with steady hands and the knowledge that what she was about to expose would not be pretty but was necessary for survival. 3 years of forensic accounting laid out in documents that traced a network of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands to entities that connected through a series of wire transfers totaling $4.7 million to a single beneficiary. She looked at her brother across the table that their parents had never imagined would become a battlefield. Yours? The blood left Dominic's face in stages, a slow recession that started at his cheeks and moved inward like a tide, withdrawing from a shore it would not return to. He started to speak, and she continued over him with the relentless momentum of someone who has been building a case while her opponent was building a trap, and has arrived at this moment with the patience of a woman who understands that the most effective response to an ambush is one that was prepared months in advance. The SEC has been investigating for 18 months. I've been cooperating quietly, building the evidence, waiting to see how far you'd go. She paused long enough for the pause to fill with everything the room was beginning to understand. Now I know. She turned to the board. Every member, one by one. Eye contact that did not waver because wavering was a luxury she had never been able to afford and would not begin affording now. My brother has been stealing from this company for 3 years, embezzling donor funds, siphoning corporate revenue into personal offshore accounts. And when the embezzlement alone wasn't enough to force me out, he manufactured a scandal. She placed one of the surveillance photographs on the table, the same image that had been projected on the ballroom screen 12 hours earlier. He hired a private investigator to follow me. He compiled photographs taken out of context, and last night, in front of 500 people, he weaponized a good man's poverty and my attempt to help him in order to create a distraction from his own crimes. Dominic stood. The motion was sudden and contained the energy of a man whose contingency plans are collapsing in real time. This is fabrication. She's manipulating the narrative to cover her own. Helen Callister's voice cut across the room with the authority of a woman who had spent 68 years developing a tolerance for nonsense and had reached her limit approximately 30 seconds ago. Sit down. He sat, not because she outranked him, but because the command carried a weight that his body obeyed before his pride could intervene. Caroline continued with the precision of someone presenting evidence to people who needed to understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. Nathan Mercer's scholarship application was one of 47 submitted to the Foundation's re-entry program. He was selected by an independent review committee on the basis of merit. His test scores rank in the 97th percentile of all program participants. He has saved 3 patient lives during clinical rotations. His supervising physician, Dr. Grace Holloway, describes him as the most naturally gifted nurse she has worked with in 30 years. She closed the folder with the finality of a closing argument that requires no rebuttal. But the embezzlement, Dominic, that's documented too. Bank records, wire transfers, offshore accounts, shell corporation filings, every dollar traced, every transaction time-stamped. The boardroom door opened. 2 men in dark suits entered with the quiet authority of people who do not need to announce themselves because their credentials are visible and their purpose is apparent. FBI. They had been waiting in the lobby for 11 minutes, long enough for Carolyn to finish her presentation, short enough that Dominic had no time to make a phone call or compose a text or take any of the evasive actions that people take when they realize the walls they've been building around other people have been built around themselves instead. The FBI has everything, Dominic. They've had it for 6 months. I gave it to them. His mouth opened and closed and opened again. The mechanical motion of a man processing the discovery that the power he believed he was wielding had never been his. That every move he had made for the past 3 years had been observed and documented and filed by the sister he had underestimated for exactly as long as she had been outmaneuvering him. His voice came out smaller than it had ever sounded in this building, stripped of the careful, measured concern that had been his primary instrument for 15 years. We can discuss this privately. We're family. Caroline looked at him with an expression that held neither hatred nor satisfaction, only the clear-eyed recognition of what had been lost and what remained. We were family. Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't sabotage. Family doesn't stand on a stage and try to destroy someone's life for personal gain. She nodded to the agents, and they moved to either side of Dominic and escorted him out of the conference room with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before and would do it again, and understood that the exit should be swift and quiet because the drama had already happened, and what was left was just procedure. The boardroom was silent in the specific way that rooms are silent when the people inside them are recalculating everything they thought they knew. 12 board members sat around a table processing the collapse of a man they had been considering as an alternative to the woman standing at the head of it. Caroline gripped the back of her chair with both hands and addressed the room with a voice that held steady through what came next, only because she had decided it would, not because holding steady was easy. 8 months ago, I almost died on a plane. 53 people watched. 1 filmed it. And 1 man, a man who works 3 jobs, who can't afford health insurance for his daughter, who was racing across the country to say goodbye to his dying mother, saved my life. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He disappeared before anyone could even learn his name. That man taught me something I'd forgotten building this company. Worth isn't measured in stock prices or quarterly earnings or how many zeros sit on your balance sheet. It's measured in what you do when no one's watching. It's measured in whether you help someone who has nothing to offer you in return. She looked around the table at the faces that would determine in the next 30 seconds whether the company she had built from nothing would continue to be hers. If this board believes that supporting people like Nathan Mercer is an inappropriate use of foundation resources, if you believe that giving a second chance to a man who gave me my life back is somehow a misuse of donor money, then you can have my resignation today, right now, this moment. Because I would rather lose this chair than lose the first person who ever saw me as something other than a number on a spreadsheet. Helen Callister spoke first into the silence that followed, her voice carrying the particular clarity of someone who has watched something unfold exactly as she expected and has prepared her response accordingly. I move we table all discussion of the CEO's personal relationships and refocus the board's attention on the criminal referral for Dominic Weston. Do I have a second? 3 voices said, seconded simultaneously, and the vote that followed was unanimous in the way that votes are unanimous when the alternative is indefensible and everyone in the room has arrived at the same conclusion at the same time. Caroline made it to the elevator before her hands started shaking. She made it to the lobby before the tears came, The tears she had been holding behind the boardroom composure, and the billion-dollar armor and the steady voice that had carried her through 20 minutes of exposing her brother's betrayal while defending the man she loved to a room full of people who measured love in basis points and quarterly projections. She made it through the lobby doors and into the morning light where Chicago was going about its business with the cheerful indifference of a city that does not pause for the personal earthquakes happening inside its buildings. And there he was. Nathan was sitting on the bench outside the building in last night's suit, Josie's crooked tie still knotted at his throat, looking exactly like a man who had slept in his car, which he had, and who had been sitting on this bench since 6 a.m, which he had, and who had almost walked away from everything and been talked back from the edge by an 8-year-old girl with a one-eyed teddy bear and a message that she had memorized because it was the kind of thing you remember. He stood when he saw her. She stopped. 3 feet between them. 3 feet and 42 years of armor. And 8 years of hiding. And every wall they had ever built to keep the world from reaching the terrified hoping parts of themselves that they had locked away so long ago they had forgotten where they put the key. Dominic's been arrested. The board voted unanimously. He crossed the distance in 3 steps and pulled her into his arms, and she stiffened for 1 second. The duration of 20 years of armor encountering the unfamiliar physics of being held by someone who wanted nothing from her except her. And then the stiffness broke and she softened against him and pressed her face into his shoulder and shook with everything she had been carrying since the gala. And before the gala, and before the company, and before the walls. All of it releasing at once into the shoulder of a man wearing a crooked tie his daughter had knotted in a bathroom 12 hours ago. I thought I lost you. When you walked out of that ballroom, I thought you were gone forever. I almost was. Josie talked me off the ledge. She delivered your message. Her laugh came out broken and wet against his collar. We're quite a pair, aren't we? A billionaire who doesn't know how to be loved and a nurse who forgot he deserved to be. Maybe we can figure it out together. Nathan's first week as a certified registered nurse at Cook County Medical Center began on a Monday morning that smelled like fresh scrubs and industrial coffee and the particular nervous energy of a man starting a job that is also a homecoming. His badge read Nathan Mercer, RN, and he touched it 3 times before leaving the apartment, running his thumb across the 2 letters that had defined him before they became a reminder of everything he lost. 2 letters that Megan had celebrated with a cake that said Nurse Hottie in blue frosting because she believed that professionalism was overrated and her husband deserved to laugh. Day 3. The call came over the ER radio at 2:47 in the afternoon with the clipped urgency of dispatchers who have learned to compress catastrophe into short sentences. Commuter bus collision on the Dan Ryan Expressway. Multi-vehicle pileup. 14 incoming patients. Multiple critical. ETA 8 minutes. The emergency room shifted into the controlled chaos that is the natural habitat of people who have chosen to work in places where the worst day of someone's life is a Tuesday. Dr. Holloway took command of triage and made a decision that every nurse in the department would discuss for weeks afterward. Mercer, you're running secondary triage. Every patient through your hands first. Red, yellow, green. Can you do this? Every head in the ER turned toward the man with 3 days on his badge and 8 years in the wilderness, and hands that had saved a billionaire at 30,000 feet, and a grandmother named Dorothy in a code blue, and a daughter in an apartment at midnight. He met Holloway's eyes across the room. I can do this. The patients arrived in waves, and Nathan sorted them with a precision that turned the chaos into something that resembled choreography. 3 in the first wave, 2 walking wounded tagged green, and 1 compound fracture tagged yellow, triaged in 90 seconds. 5 in the second wave, and here the complexity deepened. A pregnant woman at 32 weeks contracting from the impact, tagged red, routed to obstetrics. An elderly man with a chest wound and falling oxygen, tagged red, possible pneumothorax. A teenager with a head laceration bleeding freely but conscious and talking. And Nathan stopped. He looked at her eyes. The left pupil was dilated wider than the right by a margin that the paramedics had missed because they were looking at the blood and not at the asymmetry beneath it. Traumatic brain injury hiding behind a laceration. He upgraded her to red and called for an immediate CT. Holloway watched from across the ER and nodded because she had seen it too. But Nathan had seen it first. 4 more in the third wave, including a cardiac arrest arriving under active CPR and an internal bleed with blood pressure in free fall. Nathan took the internal bleed himself because every other nurse was occupied and the patient couldn't wait for availability to catch up with need. Large bore IV, blood typed and cross-matched. Direct pressure on the abdominal wound while he called for surgical backup with the calm authority of someone issuing instructions from a place deeper than training, from the place where instinct and experience have fused into something that operates faster than thought. The final wave brought 2. A bus driver with massive trauma and fractures that told the story of an impact his body had absorbed so that the passengers behind him wouldn't have to. And a 7-year-old girl, conscious but in shock, clutching a stuffed rabbit with both hands and staring at the ceiling with the wide, unblinking gaze of a child whose world has just demonstrated that it can hurt her. Nathan looked at her, and for one searing fraction of a second, he saw Josie. He saw Megan. He saw every ghost that had ever stood between him and the work his hands were built to do. The fraction passed. He lifted the girl and carried her to the trauma bay and talked to her the way he talked to his daughter, warm and certain and present. "What's your friend's name?" "Benny." "Well, Benny's going to stay right here with you while I make sure you're all patched up." The bus driver was crashing, blood pressure dropping despite aggressive fluid resuscitation. Nathan read the injury pattern and the vitals and the trajectory of the numbers on the monitor and made a decision that a nurse with 3 days on his badge should not have the authority to make, but that a nurse with 8 years of ICU experience and 1,000 emergencies stored in his muscle memory had every right to execute. He initiated a massive transfusion protocol and called the surgical team and bought the surgeon 3 minutes that the surgeon did not have and would not have gotten from anyone else in that room on that afternoon. 14 patients, 0 fatalities. Every single person who came through those doors on stretchers and backboards and in the arms of paramedics left the hospital alive. Holloway found him in the break room, sitting on a plastic chair staring at his hands. The same hands. Always. The same hands. "You upgraded 3 triage classifications the paramedics missed, including a TBI that would have been discharged to the waiting room if you hadn't caught the pupil asymmetry. You initiated massive transfusion protocol on the bus driver and bought surgical 3 minutes they didn't have. That's not a returning nurse, Mercer. That's a senior charge nurse with a decade of experience who happened to take 8 years off." What Nathan did not know was that Caroline had been in the building. A scheduled meeting with the hospital's diagnostic technology team, part of her company's expansion into underserved medical facilities. She had arrived as the mass casualty call came in and she had watched from the observation gallery above the ER as Nathan triaged 14 patients with the quiet authority of a man who had finally stopped running from the thing he was born to do. She watched him carry a 7-year-old girl to a trauma bay while talking to her about a stuffed rabbit. She watched him stabilize a bus driver whose life was measured in the minutes Nathan's decision had purchased. She watched, and she did not tell him she had watched because some things are better witnessed than announced. 1 week later, the hospital held a brief ceremony for the ER team that had achieved 0 fatalities on a mass casualty event. Holloway singled Nathan out with words that carried the weight of someone who does not distribute praise casually and has therefore accumulated a reserve of it that hits harder when finally deployed. In 30 years of emergency medicine, very few nurses walk in on their 3rd day and run a mass casualty triage like they never left. Mercer, you didn't just come back to nursing. You reminded the rest of us why we do this. The surgeon who had operated on the bus driver found Nathan afterward and said the thing that would stay with him longer than any certificate or commendation or round of applause. Those 3 minutes you bought me. That's the difference between a family mourning and a family celebrating Christmas. Nathan looked across the room. Caroline stood by the door. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, just the woman who had sat in the dirt with him in a $2,000 dress in a hospital parking lot in Arizona, while the sun went down and the sirens wailed, and 2 people from opposite ends of everything discovered that the distance between them was shorter than either had believed. She caught his eye. She didn't wave. She didn't call attention to herself, or to the moment, or to the magnitude of what he had accomplished. She nodded, and mouthed 2 words that crossed the room without making a sound, and landed in a place inside him that had been empty for 8 years, and was not empty anymore. Welcome back. That night, after Josie fell asleep, Nathan sat alone at the kitchen table with Megan's ring in his palm. Small and gold and simple. She hadn't wanted diamonds. She said they were just rocks that rich people agreed were special, and she refused to participate in collective delusion. He had worn it on a chain against his chest for 8 years, carried it to every janitor's closet and warehouse floor and midnight shift and borrowed mattress and hospital room and parking lot and courtroom and cafeteria, and every dark, exhausted moment when the weight of the ring against his sternum was the only evidence he had that he had once been loved by someone who thought he was extraordinary. Megan. I think I'm ready. He told her about everything. The apartment and the program and the exams and the code blues and the 14 patients and the surgeon who said 3 minutes was the difference between grief and Christmas. He told her about Caroline. She's stubborn and terrified, and she works too hard, and she doesn't know how to accept love, which is honestly a little ironic because she has more of it to give than anyone I've met since you. She sees me, Megan, really sees me. Not the janitor, not the man who couldn't save you, just me. He placed the ring in Ruth's wooden box and closed the lid with a gentleness that was not goodbye but rearrangement, not ending but expansion. The same way a house adds a room without demolishing the rooms that came before. I'm not replacing you. I'm not forgetting you. I'm just making room, like you told me to. You said, don't let me be the end of my story. I understand now. The next morning, Josie exploded through the front door with a piece of construction paper flapping like a victory flag. Nathan was in new scrubs with his badge on his chest, and Caroline was behind Josie in the doorway, slightly out of breath from a school drop-off routine that had developed without discussion or negotiation, or either adult acknowledging that it meant something larger than logistics. 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall one with short brown hair drawn in heavy strokes, a medium one with black hair and a red dress outlined twice with unusual care, a small one in the middle with arms stretched impossibly wide like wings reaching to hold both larger figures at once. And tucked under the small figure's arm, rendered in meticulous detail that surpassed everything else on the page, a one-eyed teddy bear in brown and tan. It's us. Miss Whitfield said, "Draw your family," so I drew our family. In the corner, 2 smaller figures floated among clouds and yellow crayon stars with wide smiles and open arms. That's Mommy and Grandma Ruth. They're watching from heaven. A triangle of yellow crayon sat on Caroline's head. A crown. Because Daddy says you're the queen of your castle, but queens get lonely in their castles. So I drew you with us, because queens need families too. Then Josie's voice wobbled and her chin trembled and Captain Buttons got squeezed hard enough to test the structural limits of hospital gift shop craftsmanship. Is that okay? To have a new family? Because Emma at school says you can only have one family, and if you get a new one, it means you forgot the old one. But I don't want to forget Mommy. I just also want this. Nathan pulled her close. We can love Mommy and Grandma forever and still have room for more. Love isn't like money. It doesn't run out when you share it. 15 months after Flight 1847, somewhere over Pennsylvania, an elderly man in row 3 clutched his chest. Nathan was already moving. Caroline was right behind him with the medical kit open and organized before he reached the patient. They worked together the way 2 people work who have been through enough to know that partnership is not about perfection, but about presence. The man stabilized. A young mother across the aisle watched them walk back to their seats. How do you 2 do that? Like you've been partners forever. Nathan looked at Caroline. Someone believed I was worth saving. She taught me to believe it too. Caroline took his hand. And he taught me what worth really means. It has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with who you become when no one's watching. At Logan Airport, Josie came sprinting through the terminal with a sign in purple marker that read, "Welcome home, Di and Miss Corona," with 47 heart stickers. She grabbed both their hands and started walking toward baggage claim, swinging slightly with each step the way children swing when they feel safe enough to let their feet leave the ground. Captain Buttons says, "You're not lucky, Daddy." He says you're brave, because lucky just happens to you. But brave is something you choose. And somewhere above them, where 2 crayon figures smiled among yellow stars, 2 women who had loved Nathan Mercer with everything they had watched him walk into the light with his daughter on one side and his future on the other. And they were not sad. They were not grieving. They were not gone. They were proud.